He boasted about Deathworld beasts, then the Deathworld girl exposed she was harder than them. The hologram bay on Apex Station 9 smelled like recycled air and old certainty. Instructor Prime Thale Vorak had delivered this lecture 80 times. He knew the smell the way he knew the weight of his data slate, so familiar it had stopped registering as information. The lecture hall was carved into a repurposed docking bay, and the ceiling arched 40 meters overhead, and every meter of it was his. He had never once doubted that. He reviewed the morning roster on the way in: 31 cadets, 16 species, 1 human. He paused on that last entry for exactly as long as it took to read it, which was not long. Corporal Myra Solon, Terran Expeditionary Corps, age 24, field certifications across 4 continents, 2 subpolar deployments, 1 entry in the notes field which said, intake form unusually concise. He filed this under culturally exotic, biologically standard, which was where he filed all human data, and moved on. His chromatophores settled to amber. The hall filled around him while he checked the hologram bay calibration. Cadets arrived in clusters, a group of Dasari nodding to one another with the slow, formal bobs of their species, 2 Kellen who sat perfectly still the way Kellen always did when they were nervous, a Veth cadet who found the back row and immediately checked all 3 exits. Vorak noted this last one with approval. Good survival instinct. Reasonable. The human arrived alone, 3 minutes before the start time. She was compact, 1.6 meters, carrying a worn canvas bag over one shoulder. She found a seat in the back row without looking at the exit, took out a notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. Vorak almost made a note about the notebook. Paper, handwritten, the kind of object a survey team might find in an archaeological context. He decided it was beneath the lecture's dignity and turned back to his calibration screen. The stress monitor board was live, 31 biosign lines, each one a different color. He knew from experience that by the end of the hour, most of them would be spiking. He called the room to attention. The Galactic Threat Index, Vorak said, exists because the galaxy does not care whether you are ready for it. He let that land. He had a good delivery for this line: 40 cycles of refinement. Every organism, every environment, every weather pattern that has ever ended a survey mission has been catalogued, classified, and assigned a number. The GTI is that number. A GTI Class 1 organism is an irritant. A GTI Class 7 organism. He touched the display panel and let the Terminus Growhound file load behind him. Just the icon, just the silhouette, is the reason we do not send unprotected survey teams to certain sectors. A Dasari cadet in the 3rd row shifted backward by about 4 centimeters. The stress monitor for that seat ticked upward. In 40 cycles of teaching this course, I have processed 3,400 cadets across 31 species. I have never once had a student leave this lecture less frightened of the universe than when they arrived. He said it without pride, just fact. This is not a flaw in my teaching, it is the correct result. He touched the panel again, and the GTI classification grid expanded across the back wall. Species, environments, organisms, events, all ranked, all numbered. You will notice, he said, that the human species occupies position 41 on this chart. He did not look at Solon when he said this. He said it the way he said every data point, with the mild satisfaction of a man reading a tide table. Position 41 was generous in his assessment, but humans had a tendency to land in environments that killed their equipment before it killed them, which counted for something. Biologically standard, he said, culturally exotic at most, tool use accounts for the majority of their documented survival outcomes. The human in the back row did not react. She was writing something in the notebook. He activated Hologram Bay 1. The Valdoris Pack Hunter materialized above the podium at 5 times life size, and the atmospheric processor pushed a low heat signature into the air to match. The creature was 2 meters at the shoulder, 6-limbed, with venom sacs clustered at 3 joint locations that glowed a specific orange on the thermal overlay. It turned its head. Across the monitor board, 11 biosigns moved. The Valdoris Pack Hunter, Vorak said, GTI Class 4, Coordinated Pursuit Predator, hunting by thermal signature in pack formations of 5 to 20 individuals. Venom delivery is contact-based, not projectile. 3 SAC locations. He highlighted each one in the hologram with a pulse of blue. First contact fatality rate, 62%. He let the number sit. He always let that number sit. The Kellen cadet had stopped moving. The Dasari in the third row was now very still in the particular way of something that has assessed the nearest cover and found it inadequate. On the monitor board, 3 lines had crossed into the yellow alert band. Solon looked up from her notebook for the first time. She studied the hologram with the particular expression of someone reading a menu. Then she said, "Sounds like dingoes." Vorak turned. "Excuse me," he said. "Pack hunters, thermal tracking." She tilted her head. "The venom's a bit extra, but the pack dynamic is the same. You just don't make eye contact and you're usually fine." She looked back down at the notebook. "How big do the packs usually get?" He told her, 20 in recorded cases. "Okay," she said and wrote something down, not in alarm. She was making notes. Vorak held his expression. His chromatophores held amber, though something at the edges had gone slightly muddier, the way pigment does when the signal underneath it isn't fully decided. He attributed it to the atmospheric processor running warm and turned back to the class. The Dasari cadet, besides Solon, was looking at her the way you look at something you haven't correctly classified yet. Vorak closed the Valdoris file. He had not planned to move this quickly to rung 2. He preferred to let rung 1 breathe. But the room's calibration had shifted in a way he didn't entirely like. Not too calm, not the loose, relaxed calm of an underprepared student, but a different kind of calm that he had not encountered before in this seat at the back of this room. And he found himself reaching for the next file with a speed that he told himself was pedagogical pacing. He was not rushing, he was pacing. The Keth spine crawler loaded. It was smaller than the Valdoris, which students always found more unsettling. Smaller meant harder to track. The exoskeleton was rated to withstand most standard-issue survey tools, and the venom was calcium-specific. It dissolved calcium-based bone structure, and it worked in 40 seconds, and the fatality overlay put unprotected first contact encounters at 78%. He had used that number in this room many times. It tended to produce a specific silence. He read out the venom mechanism. He said 40 seconds clearly, with appropriate weight. The Kellen cadet made a very small sound that was not quite a word. "Oh," Solon said. She was looking at the hologram now, head tilted the other way. "So it's like a cone snail, but with legs." Vorak said nothing. "We have those on Earth." She turned back to her notebook. "You just wear shoes." Then, as if the thought had followed naturally, "Are there any in the station's hydroponics bay? I'd like to check." The cadet beside her had stopped breathing. This was visible on the biosign monitor as a held flat line that lasted for 4 seconds before resuming. Vorak checked Solon's monitor. It was the flattest line on the board. It had been flat since the beginning of the lecture. He checked it a second time in case the sensor was malfunctioning. The sensor was not malfunctioning. He made a note on his slate. He labeled it atmospheric processor because he was not yet ready to label it anything else, and he turned back to the class with the practiced transition of a man who has run this lecture 80 times and knows exactly where he is going. He knew exactly where he was going. The breach grounder file was already loading. "You've met the Valdoris pack hunter. Stay close. What comes next has never once left this room with a normal biosign reading, not once in 40 cycles." 3 hours before the lecture, in the small office 2 levels below Lecture Hall 7C, Vorak had reviewed his course notes over a thermos of iron-filtered water that had gone slightly cold. He had added nothing to them. He had not needed to add anything to them in 11 cycles. The notes were complete. He had looked briefly at the human's intake file. Concise was the word the intake officer had used. The certifications were listed but not explained. Patagonian Steppe Ranger, certified. Deep Ocean Survey Laid, Grade 2. He had seen those environments on the GTI chart. They were not impressive environments by interstellar standards. Earth was not an impressive environment. He had closed the file and gone upstairs. The thermos was still on his desk. He realized he had not finished it. He thought about this for no more than a second and returned to the lesson. The breech grounder materialized slowly, always slowly, because the point was the reveal. It came up through the floor of the hologram space, and the display showed it in cross-section. The body below, the sensor array distributed through 6 limbs, and the acoustic detection system that let it track a heartbeat through 3 meters of composite flooring. The room's atmospheric processor shifted, dropping temperature 2 degrees, because the breech grounder hunted in cool substrate, and the shift was part of the presentation. Subterranean ambush predator, Vorak said, GTI Class 6, detection mechanism, seismic acoustic array tuned to organic heartbeat frequency, detection range through standard composite construction, 3 meters. He paused. It knows you are there before you step onto its substrate. It does not wait. It fires from below. 12 biosigns crossed into yellow. 3 had reached orange. Solon was sketching in the notebook margin. He could see it from the podium, a rough cross-section, the creature's detection radius rendered in quick lines, annotations in a small, neat hand. She was drawing the diagram he had just described and adding notes. Trapdoor spider situation, she said. She didn't look up. You stomp before you step. Standard procedure. Vorak checked his monitor board. Solon's biosign was flat. He looked at her, then he looked at the board. Then he looked at her again, and for the first time in this lecture, he held the look longer than a standard pedagogical assessment required. The room had stopped generating the quiet ambient noise that rooms always make. No shuffle, no breath adjustment, no small sounds of posture changing. The 30 other cadets were watching Solon with the specific quality of attention that Vorak, in 40 cycles of teaching, had only ever seen pointed at a hologram. She finished her diagram. She turned the page. The breech grounder rotated above the podium. Its detection radius pulsed in slow rings. Vorak closed the file. He did not close it because the lesson called for it. He closed it because the room had gone so quiet that the hologram's ambient hum was the loudest sound in it, and that was not the correct acoustic profile for a Class 6 reveal. The correct profile involved at least 4 students in audible respiratory distress. He had 3 in orange on the board. Solon's line was flat enough to suggest the sensor had reset. He pulled up the next file. The Eric Stormherd was his largest mass event example, and he had used it for 15 cycles because nothing else in the catalog produced quite the same effect. Individual threat assessment meant nothing here. The GTI Class 6 rating applied to the collective, 200 animals moving as a single directed event, capable of leveling settlement-grade construction, navigating by low-frequency vibration that traveled through the ground ahead of them like a wave. Survey teams that had encountered a storm herd in migration had not, as a rule, filed reports themselves. The reports were filed by whoever reached the site afterward. He brought the hologram up at full ceiling scale. The herd in motion looked like a weather event. It filled the room. The atmospheric processor pushed a low subsonic frequency that students felt in their teeth and their sternums, and the hologram's edge dissolved into the walls, so the migration appeared to move through the room rather than above it. It was the most technically impressive display in his sequence. The Dasari cadet in the 3rd row made a sound he had not heard from a Dasari before. Low, involuntary. On the monitor board, 6 lines crossed orange simultaneously. 200 individuals, Vorak said. Mass event classification. The threat is not the animal. The threat is the collective displacement. He let the herd move across the ceiling, the sound building in the floor. Standard grade settlement walls fail at the 3rd wave. Prefabricated survey shelters fail at the 1st. There is no catalog deterrent for a full migration event. Avoidance is the only protocol. He looked at Solon. She was watching the ceiling with what he could only describe as mild interest. Buffalo, she said. The word sat in the room like a dropped object. I'm sorry, Vorak said. That's what we call them, or called them. Similar animal, lived on the plains. She looked back at the herd moving across the ceiling. You persistence hunt them, you run until they're tired. The room was very quiet. Vorok said, you run. Yeah, a few days, usually. She tilted her head. 3, sometimes 4, you track, you keep pace, you let them run until they can't sustain the flight response. Then they stop. She appeared to consider something. It's more of an endurance thing than a skill thing, honestly. A Kellen cadet named Bront, who had been motionless since rung 2, said, in a voice that was hoping it had misheard. A few days meaning, you run for a few days. Continuous, yeah, Solon said. She sounded apologetic about it, without stopping. Bront looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down. He had been sitting already, but he seemed to fold slightly, as if something structural had given way, and he became a smaller version of himself in the chair. The edge of laughter that had been building in the room since the dingoes, quiet, tension-release laughter, the kind that comes from surprise, was gone. It had been present at rung 1. It had been quieter at rung 2. Now it was simply absent, and what replaced it was a different quality of attention that Vorok did not have a formal name for, but which felt similar to the state he had seen students enter when they stopped processing the hologram as an academic exercise and started processing it as a real thing. The storm herd moved across the ceiling. The floor hummed. Vorok's chromatophores, which he had not been tracking, had shifted to amber with a distinct grey undertone. He closed the herd file. He reached for the next one. He had used the terminus growhound as his ceiling for 23 cycles. There was always a moment, reaching for that file, where he allowed himself a small professional satisfaction. Other instructors used softer closers. Vorok used the class 7. The GTI notation was direct, no non-lethal deterrent catalogued, avoidance strongly recommended. He had read that notation into the record so many times he could have said it backward. The growhound loaded. It came in large, larger than the storm herd, larger than anything else in the sequence, and the atmospheric processor went cold, genuinely cold, because the growhound was a temperature gradient hunter, and the cold was part of how it found you. 12 meters mass heavy, with an articulation structure that allowed the jaw to expand past what the skull suggested was possible, and an appetite that required twice its body mass every standard week, which meant it was always hungry, which the GTI notation also mentioned. 14 biosign lines crossed into the orange band. 3 hit red. Vorok waited. He had not spoken yet. He let the hologram turn. He let the cold work. Then he read the GTI entry, all of it, including the appetite notation and the mass requirement and the sentence about non-lethal deterrence. He read it slowly. He had a good delivery for this entry. He had refined it over 2 decades. The room was completely silent. He looked at Solon. She was studying the hologram with the focused expression she had used on the breech grounder, not the idle tilted head look from the earlier rungs. This was a different kind of attention, analytical, specific, the expression of someone running a calculation. She said, "Go for the joints." No one moved. The articulation has to be somewhere, knees, elbows, wherever the armor plating bends. She gestured vaguely at the growhound's front limbs. If it comes to that. She paused and then said, with the air of someone correcting a first impression, though I'd try to avoid the engagement entirely. That would be the preference. I'd only go for the joints if I had no choice. I don't want to make it sound like a first option. She sounded genuinely concerned about having given the wrong impression. The Dasari cadet had stopped generating ambient chromatophore signals. That was not, technically, possible. Dasari never stopped generating them, and yet Vorok's biology scanner was showing a flatline. 11 of his stress monitors were now in full alarm. He checked Solon's line. Flat, completely flat. The same reading he had taken at rung 1 when she had asked how big the packs usually got. Not low, not controlled, flat. The baseline of someone who was not managing a response. The baseline of someone for whom no response was required. His chromatophores went gray-violet. He noticed this and did not correct it. He had never gone gray-violet in this room. The terminus growhound turned above the podium. The cold from the atmospheric processor sat in the room. 14 students were in various degrees of physiological alarm, and the one student with the lowest biosign in the room had just suggested targeting the joint articulation of a GTI Class 7 organism as a contingency measure, and had then apologized for implying it might be a reasonable first move. Vorok stood at the podium. He was trying to locate a ceiling. In 40 cycles, the Class 7 had been the ceiling. Above it, nothing. The GTI did not have a Class 8 in common use. He had never needed one. He opened his classification interface. He was not sure exactly what he was looking for. He told himself he was looking for context. He typed in the search field Earth/Terran/Sol system. The file loaded slowly. The Dasari cadet beside Solon had, at some point during rung 5, stopped sitting in the normal Dasari posture and was now sitting in a posture that Vorok associated with prey assessments. Back straight, very still, eyes forward. The posture of something recalibrating whether the thing it had been sitting next to was what it had assumed it was. The Kellen Bront had not recovered from the buffalo. He was writing something on his own tablet, and when Vorok's ambient scanner picked up the text briefly on a sweep, it read, "Run for 3-4 days without stopping," and then, below that, just the word, "Why?" Vorok's Earth file was loading. It was loading slowly because, he would understand later, the file was not a short file. It was a long file with a great many columns that had been started and not completed. The survey team that had filed the initial report had done their work in standard intervals across 4 planetary months, and what they had found had apparently required several follow-up reports, and then a specialist review request, and then, at some point, the file had been flagged pending classification review, and that flag had apparently never been resolved because it was still there, 18 years on, and the classification field itself. The loading bar completed. The classification field was blank. Not zero, not in progress, not redacted or restricted. Blank, white, empty. The field existed and had been left without an entry because the GTI classification system had received the survey team's data and had, at some level of its architecture, been unable to produce a number. Vorok stared at it. He had been teaching the GTI for 40 cycles. He had never seen a blank classification field. He had seen zeros. He had seen insufficient data notations. He had never seen a field that existed and contained nothing. The Earth file was very long. He started reading. He did not read it aloud at first. The class was sitting in the silence of rung 5, the deep, recalibrated silence that the terminus growhound always produced, and which he usually let sit for 30 seconds before moving to the close. He was using those 30 seconds to read the first page of the Earth survey file, and then the second page, and then the third. Oxygen-heavy atmosphere, standard gravity slightly above baseline, named weather systems with names, recorded and categorized, and named the way you name things you plan to interact with repeatedly. Megafauna in multiple size classes on every continent. Microbial threat density that required a dedicated internal response system. The survey team had noted this with particular attention. The fact that the local apex species carried a full immune infrastructure inside their bodies as standard equipment, because the microbial environment had made it necessary. He turned to page 6. The surveyor's note at the bottom was set apart from the main report in a smaller font, in the style of an aside, the kind of notation a scientist makes when they encounter something that does not fit the established categories and they want to flag it without derailing the official report. It read, "Local apex species appears to have domesticated several predator lineage organisms for purposes unclear, possibly ritualistic. Organisms observed sleeping in proximity to apex species. Apex species demonstrates affection toward domesticated organisms. Further study required." Vorok read this sentence 3 times. He looked up at the class. He looked at Solon. She was writing in the notebook. She had filled most of the current page and was near the bottom margin. "Corporal Solon," he said. She looked up. "The Earth survey file contains a notation." He read it aloud. He read it carefully, in the same report delivery voice he used for GTI entries, because that was the voice he had available at this moment. When he finished, the room was waiting. He said, "Can you explain what this refers to?" Solon looked at him for a moment. There was nothing complicated in her expression. "Those are dogs," she said. "They're very good boys." The room did not laugh. Vorok's chromatophores, which had been grey-violet since rung 5, shifted. He would describe it later. In the curriculum addendum he filed with the division head as deep indigo. His species had a name for the color. They called it the cold realization. It was the color of being corrected by the data. In 40 cycles of teaching, he had never experienced it in this room. He had experienced it twice in his life before tonight, both times in the field, both times when something he had understood to be true had been replaced, without ceremony, by something that was simply more accurate. He sat with it for a moment. The Earth classification field was still blank on his screen. The terminus greyhound was still rotating above the podium in the cold the atmospheric processor had made. And Corporal Myra Solon had gone back to her notebook and was writing something in the bottom margin of the page, and her biosign was flat, and the room was very, very quiet. 40 cycles of certainty, one blank field, stay with it. Vorok stood at the podium and did not move for 6 seconds. He knew it was 6 seconds because the hologram's idle rotation cycle was 3 seconds, and the terminus greyhound completed 2 full turns while he stood there. He had timed this rotation when he first configured the display, back when timing things like hologram rotation cycles had seemed like the kind of detail that mattered. The blank field sat on his screen. He had 31 cadets in this room, and he had a curriculum to close, and he had been teaching threat assessment for 40 cycles, and the correct next move was to file the Earth data away as an anomaly, a classification pending entry, interesting as context, not relevant to the course objectives, and continue to the session summary and the reading list and the dismissal. He reached for his data slate. He opened the GTI reclassification request form. He was not entirely sure in the moment why he was doing this. He would think about it later and decide it was because the blank field was an error in a system he had relied on for 4 decades, and errors in reliable systems required reporting. That was the administrative explanation. The other explanation, that the blank field was not an error, but the correct output of a system that had reached the edge of its own categories, he was not yet ready to hold. He filled in the species field, human/Terran/Sol system. He submitted it. The form acknowledged receipt with a quiet chime that was audible in the silence. 31 cadets watched him do this. He did not explain himself. He closed the form and looked at the class, and his chromatophores were deep indigo, and he was aware of this, but he did not adjust them. "We will proceed to the session summary," he said. No one moved. He delivered the summary in his standard form. He had written it 11 cycles ago and updated it twice since then, and it covered the GTI classification framework, the survival methodology for Class 4 through 6 encounters, and the general principle that rated threat environments required rated threat preparation. He delivered all of it. He was good at delivering material he had prepared, and the indigo was still there, but it did not affect his diction. What was different was the room. In 40 cycles, he had ended this lecture with students in varying states of productive alarm, alert, recalibrated, appropriately impressed by the scale of what was out there. That was the correct end state. He had refined this session to produce it. The 30 cadets who were not Solon were watching him with a different quality of attention. They were alert, yes, but they kept glancing sideways, not at the holograms, not at the exit, but at the back row, at a compact human woman who had filled 2 pages of a paper notebook and whose biosign had not varied by a measurable unit since she sat down. Vorok noted this. He did not remark on it. He finished the summary, stated the reading list, and dismissed the class. They left slowly. That was the other difference. Normally, the relief of ending pulled students through the exits in a wave, the released tension from 60 minutes of cumulative GTI exposure. Today they left in a careful trickle, and more than one of them took a longer route to the exit that happened to pass by the back row, and their eyes were doing the specific calculation that eyes do when they are trying to categorize something they thought they understood. The Kellen cadet, Bront, paused beside Solon's desk. He looked at her notebook. She was still writing, and then at her, and then he said very carefully, 3 to 4 days. Give or take, Solon said. She didn't look up. Bront nodded. He left. He was moving with the precise, deliberate movements of someone who has decided to be very intentional about how they use their body from now on. The room emptied. Borak remained at the podium. He was alone, or nearly alone. Solon was still in the back row, finishing a line in the notebook. The hologram bays had gone to standby. The ceiling was dark, no creatures, no overlay data. The atmospheric processor had returned the room to standard temperature. The biosign board was clearing itself line by line as students exited, and the last line to remain was hers, flat and steady, until she stood up and slung the canvas bag over her shoulder, and it cleared too. She was heading for the exit. She had left the notebook on the desk. He saw it for the same reason he always saw things left behind. 40 cycles of watching students pack in distraction had made him good at spotting the wrong object in an emptying room. The notebook was on the desk, closed, the water damage on its bottom corner facing up. He should call after her. He did not call after her. He walked to the back row. He picked up the notebook. He opened it. He had told himself, reaching for it, that he was going to find the page she had turned to at the end and read the note she had been finishing. A practical reason, in case it was a question for him, a student note requiring follow-up. The last page was half-filled. Her handwriting was small and very neat, and it covered the right margin as well as the main lines, and it was organized by rung. Next to each of his GTI entries, she had added a cross-reference, a field observation from what he assumed was her own experience, compared against his classification data. The Valdoris entry read, coordination similar to dingo packs, thermal tracking confirmed, size variance smaller than stated field, average closer to 12. The spine crawler, venom mechanism equals cone snail variant, earth analog, calcium specific confirmed. Note, boot sole material matters. The breech grounder, acoustic range of 3 m is conservative estimate based on hard composite, in soft substrate likely higher, worth testing. He turned to the entry for the terminus growhound. It was the last entry before the page ran into the bottom margin. She had written it in the same small, neat hand, the same measured annotation style, and it said, Class 7 is the growhound. We have those. We call them saltwater crocodiles. GTI is generous. Vorak read this sentence. He read it again. The hologram bays were dark. The biosign board was clear. He was standing in the back row of his own lecture hall, holding a water-damaged notebook and the classification ceiling of the GTI. The highest number his teaching architecture had ever required was, according to the annotation he was reading, a generous assessment of an organism that the local apex species of an unclassified planet had assigned a common name and filed under ordinary wildlife. His chromatophores were indigo. They had been indigo for 11 minutes now. He heard footsteps. Solon came back through the door 30 seconds later. She stopped when she saw him holding the notebook, and her expression did the small shift that expressions do when something is slightly unexpected, not alarmed, not concerned, just mildly adjusted. Sorry, she said, I forgot that. He held it out to her. He was still processing the annotation. She crossed the room and took the notebook from him with the easy manner of someone collecting a jacket. I have a question, he said. She waited. He should ask about the annotation. He should ask about the saltwater crocodile, about what GTI Class 7 looked like in the field against an organism she had described with a common name, about the phrase GTI is generous and what she thought generous meant in this context. Instead, he said, when you look at the Class 7 hologram, what do you actually see? She considered this, not for long, a few seconds. Something that evolved well for its environment, she said, same as everything else. A pause. I just grew up where the bar was higher. She put the notebook in her bag. She said, I thought rung 3 was particularly good, actually, the seismic detection mechanic. I hadn't thought about it from the predator's side before, how the heartbeat frequency gives distance information, not just presence. That's interesting. She said it the way you say a thing you found genuinely interesting. No subtext, no edge on it. Vorok looked at her. He said, the detection range varies by substrate density. Right, she said, so in soft ground it would be higher than your 3-meter figure. Considerably, he said. I thought so. She pulled the bag strap up on her shoulder. Good lecture, thank you. She walked out. The door settled behind her with the soft pressure lock sound that doors in Apex Station made when they closed, and Vorok stood in the back row of his empty lecture hall with the biosign board cleared and the holograms dark and the blank GTI entry still open on his screen across the room where he had left it. He did not go back to the podium immediately. He stood in the back row for a moment in Solon's seat and looked at the podium from that angle. He had stood at that podium 800 times. He had never sat in this row. The view from here was different. Not dramatically, it was the same room, but the podium looked like the thing it was from this angle. A position someone stood in to deliver information they were certain of to people who were not yet certain. He thought about what she had said. I just grew up where the bar was higher. He thought about the blank field, not zero, not insufficient data, blank. He walked back to the podium. He picked up his data slate. He opened the curriculum addendum request form. Section, Advanced Survey Methodology, Supplementary Units. He typed the species name, Human/Terran. He typed the proposed unit title, Terran Survival Methodology, Supplementary Framework for Advanced Survey Cadets. He set the addressee to the division head. He flagged it for priority review. In the justification field, he paused. He was not sure how to explain it. He was not sure the form had a category for what he was trying to say, any more than the GTI had a category for what he had read in the blank field and in the notebook annotation, and in the flat biosign line that had sat at the bottom of his monitor board for the entire length of the lecture. He typed one line. He submitted it. He did not read it back after submission. He set the slate down on the podium and he looked at the blank GTI entry on his main screen and he did not close it. The screen's glow was the only light left in the room. Vorok stood at the podium and did not turn it off. He was not sure why. He had turned off this screen at the end of every lecture for 40 cycles and the motion was automatic and his hand did not move toward the panel. The blank classification field sat there, white, empty. He had been looking at it long enough that the room's ambient lighting had shifted to standby mode, dimming by 20% on an automated cycle that assumed no one was still present. He was still present. The screen stayed bright. He thought about the annotation. Class 7 is the growhound. We have those. We call them saltwater crocodiles. GTI is generous. He had read that line 3 times while holding the notebook, and he had not asked her about it when she came back for it. He had asked her something else, something that felt, in the moment, more important or possibly less, and she had answered it in the same even voice she had used for every rung of the staircase, and then she had thanked him for the lecture and left. He was trying to understand the word generous. Not the concept. He understood the concept. Generous meant the number was low, that the actual threat rating of the saltwater crocodile exceeded what the GTI Class 7 classification would suggest, which meant that the organisms his teaching architecture had used as a ceiling for 4 decades were, in her assessment, not the ceiling at all. They were somewhere below it. And Earth, which had produced them, and which had also produced the woman who had spent 60 minutes annotating his slides in the margin of a paper notebook, without a single biosign deviation, was above the ceiling. Above the ceiling of a system that had never assigned Earth a number. He had a form he had filed for this. He could see the receipt notification in the corner of his screen, the reclassification request, pending review. He had filed it in front of 31 cadets without explaining himself, and they had watched him do it, and they had left in careful silence. He had a second form, the curriculum addendum, with one line in the justification field sent to the division head. He had not read it back after submission. He picked up his data slate now. He navigated to the sent form archive. He opened the curriculum addendum. The justification field read, "The GTI was built to measure what the galaxy produced. It was not built to measure what survived it." He stood with the slate for a moment. It was not a long moment. He was not a man who stood with things for long moments. He set the slate down on the podium, beside the thermos he had brought up from his office that morning and had not opened. The thermos was cold. He had not thought about it once during the lecture. He picked it up now and poured a half measure into the cap and drank it, and it tasted like 2-hour-old iron-filtered water, which was not a pleasant flavor, and he set it down. He looked at the screen. The reclassification request would go to a review committee. He knew the committee, 4 senior faculty, 1 representative from the division head's office, a date entry clerk who had been processing GTI amendments for longer than most of the faculty had been teaching. They met on the first and third cycle day of each standard month. The next meeting was 11 days away. He tried to picture the committee receiving this form. He tried to picture the data entry clerk opening the species field and reading human/Terran/Sol system, and then looking at the classification field, which had been left blank in the original survey because the GTI system had run out of applicable columns, and attempting to assign a number. He did not know what number they would assign. He was not sure the system had the column for it. He thought about the staircase. He had built it over 40 cycles, rung 1 to rung 5, each one chosen because it produced a specific response in a specific kind of student, the Valdoris for coordination threat, the spine crawler for venom mechanics, the breech grounder for sensory detection, the storm herd for scale, the growhound for the ceiling. He had run it on 3,400 cadets across 31 species, and not once, not in 80 iterations, had a student's biosign held flat through the full sequence. Not once. He had not added rung 6 on purpose. He had not planned the Earth file. He had opened it because he was looking for a ceiling above Class 7, and it had loaded, and the classification field had been blank, and he had read it aloud because he could not quite believe what he was seeing, and Solon had explained the domesticated predator lineage organisms in 11 words. 11 words, those are dogs, they're very good boys. The room had not laughed. He had not laughed. He was not laughing now. What he was doing, standing at the podium in the dimmed lighting standby mode of an empty lecture hall, was running the staircase backward. Rung 5, she said, go for the joints, present tense, practical, as if she had considered it and filed the answer and was reporting the conclusion. She had not said I read that. She had not said I think. She had said go for the joints and then apologized for making it sound like a first option. Rung 4, you run until they're tired. 3, sometimes 4 days, not as an anecdote, as a method. Rung 3, the diagram in the margin. She had drawn the breech grounder's detection radius from memory in approximately 45 seconds while he was speaking. She had annotated the substrate variable without being told the substrate variable existed. He had looked at that annotation in soft substrate, likely higher, and now he was standing alone in the room where she had drawn it and wondering when exactly she had learned that. Rung 2, you just wear shoes. Rung 1, you just don't make eye contact. She had been doing comparative field biology, not note-taking, not student notes. Comparative field biology, his GTI classifications against her own data, rung by rung, and the only rung where her data exceeded his classification was the one he had used as the ceiling of the entire system. He had not read the notebook during the lecture. He had noticed it and decided it was beneath the lecture's dignity and turned away. That was the mistake. Not the only one, maybe, but the specific, identifiable moment where the thing he should have picked up was sitting in front of him and he had not picked it up. The screen's glow had been on his face for long enough that he was slightly aware of its temperature. Screens in Apex Station ran slightly warm for visibility in the cold, recycled air of the station's lecture levels. He had never noticed this before. He noticed it now because the room was quiet, and the standby lighting had made everything else recede, and there was nothing between him and the screen. Earth's classification field, white, empty. The surveyor's footnote at the bottom of page 6, further study required. He thought, yes. He had thought that before. Standing there in the indigo 20 minutes ago, he had thought that word. He was thinking it again now, not as a conclusion, but as the only honest statement he had available. The review committee would assign a number, some number, eventually, and it would go in the field, and the blank would be filled, and the system would have a classification for Earth. But the number would be wrong. Not because the committee would do their work poorly, because the system was not built to hold the number that the planet actually was. The GTI was built to measure what the galaxy had produced, catalogued, and encountered. It was a system of known things. Earth was not, or rather, Earth was known in the way you know a thing you have looked at without seeing, which was a different kind of knowledge, and it did not translate into the columns the system had available. He would put this in a note to the committee. He was already composing it. He turned off the screen. The room went dim, just the standby amber glow along the floor-level safety strips, the kind that stayed on when everything else went off, in case someone needed to find the door. He picked up his data slate, he picked up the thermos, he walked to the door. He stopped once at the midpoint of the aisle between the seating tiers because he had a view of the back row from there, the specific seat, third from the left, where she had sat for 60 minutes with her notebook open. He stood there for exactly long enough to confirm to himself that the seat was empty and the desk was clear and the notebook was gone, which he already knew, and then he kept walking. The door opened for him and closed behind him, and the lecture hall was dark. The reclassification form was pending review. The curriculum addendum was with the division head. The blank field was closed. The surveyor's footnote, further study required, was still in the file, and the file was in the archive, and in 11 days the review committee would open it and look at the classification field and begin the work of deciding what number to put there. Vorak walked down the corridor toward his office, carrying a cold thermos and a data slate with 2 submitted forms on it, and his chromatophores were settling from indigo, slowly, the way they always settled after the cold realization, into a color that was not quite amber and not quite anything else he had a name for. The GTI was built to measure what the galaxy produced. It was not built to measure what survived it. He had written that in the justification field because it was the most accurate sentence he could construct for what he had seen today, and accuracy was, in the end, what he owed the division head, and what he owed the review committee, and what he owed the 3,400 cadets he had sent out into the galaxy with a number in their heads that was, it turned out, a ceiling that at least one species had already passed without noticing there was a ceiling there. He turned the corner into the administration corridor. Somewhere in the station, Corporal Myra Solon was doing something ordinary. He did not know what, eating, probably, or reading, or writing in the notebook, the water-damaged, handwritten, low-technology notebook that an alien species would likely find in an archaeological context and not know what to make of, same as everything else about her. He thought about the reclassification committee. He thought about the blank field and the number that would eventually fill it. He thought about writing a note to the committee recommending they consult a field specialist before assigning the classification, and then he thought about what it would mean to bring Solon into a committee room and ask her what number she thought was appropriate, and something about that image, the committee, the formal table, the forms, and Solon with the notebook, looking at the blank field the way she had looked at the terminus growhound, kept him walking for a full minute without thinking about anything else. The corridor lights were standard yellow. His office door was ahead. He had a lesson plan to update. The screen on his desk, when he sat down, was still showing the reclassification receipt notification from the form he had filed in front of 31 cadets, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he opened a new document and wrote at the top, "Note to Review Committee, Earth/Terran Classification, Preliminary Observations." He wrote for a long time.